The Dutch ship, the Amicilia, could see a flag flying from the top of a tall tree on a high point of land, fluttering over Christmas Island. This certainly bore investigation, since it was well known that there was no one living on Christmas Island. The Amicilia launched a boat, and some men rowed towards the island.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the Castaways of Vice Admiral Rijk?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The reason for the mysterious flag flying over Christmas Island was a different Dutch ship. This one named the Vice Admiral Rijk. She was a relatively new ship and considered in good condition, having been built only 6 years before, in 1846. She was a 469-ton wooden, three-masted sailing bark, built to carry cargo between Dutch holdings. On the 13th of February, 1852, she left Texel under the command of Captain Jan Bakker. On board, she had a crew of 19 men and a single passenger, Mr. Kennett, a former naval officer. They made a stop in Ramsgate, and then continued on towards Batavia. At 11 p.m. on the 27th of June, Chief Mate of the Vice Admiral Rijk, Peter Graat, was relieved on the deck of the ship by Captain Bakker, and he went below to sleep. As he went below, he could see Christmas Island in the distance, about 2.5 miles away, to the north-northeast of them. The Vice Admiral Rijk was heading north. The next morning at 4:30, the chief mate was woken up when the second mate called, "There is a heavy squall coming up, put the helm up." In the time it took Graat to reach the deck, the Vice Admiral Rijk was already grounded and was filling quickly. Graat's first thought on reaching the deck was to cut loose all of the ship's boats, but since the ship was sinking too fast for them to properly launch them, the entire crew and Mr. Kennett took refuge in a small boat that was hanging from the side of the ship. The ship sinking and the rough weather that had preceded in their ship grounding combined, however, and the small boat flipped, throwing most of the crew into the water. The only exception was Peter Graat and a deckhand named Karel Kipping, who leaped from the small boat as it began to upset and reached the poop deck, which at this point was no longer attached to the ship. Soon to join them was Mr. Kennett and the ship's cook, a man named Hollander. By the time the 4 men had gathered on the detached poop deck, the Vice Admiral Rijk was no longer above water, and neither was any other member of her crew. Mr. Kennett would later say that the ship had sunk still at full sail, and that the last he had seen of her was a cabin light before she had submerged entirely. When morning broke, the men on the makeshift raft began to row using boards from the decking, and they found a small flag that they were able to put to use as a sail as they battled to reach land. The current was running to the northwest, and rather than attempt to fight it, they instead allowed themselves to head for the northwest portion of the island. They were eventually thrown onto the shore around 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and they were forced to cling to sharp coral to prevent the still rough waves from carrying them back into the ocean. One of the waves would prove to be the end of Hollander, the cook. It smashed into all of the survivors who were clinging to the shore, but Hollander had his head smashed into the rocks with its force, and he was swept out to sea. There was no way for the others to go to his aid, since they had all been flattened by the same wave. As soon as they recovered from the blow, the 3 remaining men scrambled up the shore where the waves could not reach them. As they turned back, they could see their raft being thrown onto the coral and smashed to pieces, and the men ventured down again. They were able to salvage 3 boards and the flag that had served as their sail. They climbed up the rocks again, and this time found rainwater that had been stored in the crevices in the rock. Further on land, they found seabirds who had no experience with humans and therefore had no fear of them. The birds allowed them to get close enough that they were able to knock 2 of them out with rocks, and these they were forced to eat raw. With it having been a very long day, the 3 men spread leaves on the ground to sleep on once the sun started to go down, and they all went to sleep. The next day, they explored the woods on the island more in the hopes that they would find some sort of fruit that they could live on, since none of them had enjoyed their dinner of raw bird. They had no luck in this regard. The only fruit that they found was so bitter they could not eat it. It seemed as though birds would be their only choice. They began to dip the birds in salt water and then expose them to the sun for a few hours in an attempt to season them and make them closer to a cooked meal. They were not done exploring the island, even though they had not been able to find any other food sources. Their next project was to take the flag they had used as a sail, and they were able to tie it on a stripped branch on top of a tree on the highest point of land. They fastened the flag with tendons and put their hope in it attracting help, but in the meantime, they had other problems to deal with. They built themselves a shelter out of leaves and branches that they could sleep under and then turned their attention to fire. Being able to keep warm and cook their food would be a vast improvement of their quality of life. They had a knife at first, but they lost it in the woods. Having no metal from a blade to use, they instead disassembled a pocket watch that one of them had, and attempted to use a spring to get a spark. There were no suitable rocks to use, the rocks around being mostly coral and therefore too soft. It was suggested that in some places people started fires by rubbing bamboo together, but there was none to be had, and they were not able to find anything that would be a suitable substitute, so they gave up on the project of making a fire. They had been living off of the water that had been caught after the rain in the holes in the rock, but after a few days, these began to dry up. They therefore had to wander in search of fresh water. They made themselves shoes by fashioning pieces of wood planks they had saved from the wreckage into soles, and then using vines to tie them on. These protected the soles of their feet from coral, which had been painful and dangerous to walk on, but they were cumbersome and could cause them to trip, thus sustaining further injuries. The castaways were able to find fresh water, though it involved crossing a deep gully created by the tides. They had to build a bridge out of saplings and crawl across to reach their water source. And when the tide came in, the waves would crash over the bridge an estimated 50 feet above sea level, on one occasion taking it out entirely. They were therefore no longer in danger of starvation or dehydration, but they were far from comfortable, and they spent their time watching for ships that might see their flag and come to their aid. The second day they were on Christmas Island, June 29th, they had seen a ship sailing in the distance, but the ship failed to notice their flag and continued on its voyage. They were disappointed, but hopeful that the next ship would see them. Christmas Island was close to a shipping route, and surely one of the many ships that passed by would see their flag and come and investigate. On the 3rd of July, they saw 2 ships in close succession, and one of them drew close to the island. But their flag still did not get a response, and they could assume no one on either ship had seen it. Most of the ships that they saw sailed prudently far from Christmas Island, and by day 30 of their stay on the island, the castaways were beginning to become pessimistic and tired. In total, they had seen 20 ships sail past them without stopping, and they were starting to think that they would live out the rest of their days on Christmas Island. A thought did occur to them, though. Most of the ships passed closer to the southwest point of the island, just as the Vice Admiral Rijk had. They were on the northwest part of the island, and therefore less likely to be seen. 5 days later, another brig passed them by, this one very close to the island. And with it, the 3 men decided it was time to move camp. Moving camp was not something to be taken lightly. They were not able to follow the coastline due to the rough rocks and deep gullies that had been shaped by the strong tide. They instead were forced to travel through the woods, trusting the sun to guide them in the right direction. In some places, the woods were so thick that they hardly made any progress at all in an hour, as they used sticks to try to create a path they could walk. Every night, they would go down to the beach to sleep. Towards the middle of the island, they found a bay that forced an even larger detour as they had to walk around it. In total, their walk across the island took them 8 days, and by the time they reached the site of their new camp, their clothing was tattered rags. The new camp was even less comfortable than the one they had left behind. While in the old camp there had been crabs and rats that had bothered them at night when they slept, they now found that the other side of the island had more of both, and at times they had to get up with sticks to fight them off in the middle of the night. The crabs were by far the more aggressive of the two creatures, and often, if they were beat off from the castaways, they would turn on the rats and eat them. They also had difficulty raising the flag that they were pinning their hopes on once they reached the southwest side of Christmas Island. There was no tall tree that they could attach it to, and the highest point was a rock that it took them 2 days to scale so that they could plant their flag. Once their flag was fluttering over the island again, they were forced to go back to their long wait. They built a new shelter for themselves to live in and continued the work of finding food for themselves. They were lucky enough to have a stream that flowed down the beach where they camped, so water was still not an issue. On August 23rd, 57 days after they had landed on Christmas Island, Kenneth was working in the cabin on making a line to fish with using grass fibers. Grot and Kipping were both off in the woods hunting. Kenneth became thirsty, went down to the beach to get a drink from the stream, and that was the first time he spotted the Amicilia. His heart leapt as he saw the ship stop and lower a ship, and he tied his shirt to a stick and waved it up as a flag in the hopes that they would see it and come find him. He had almost given up. He could no longer see the ship's boat, and had not seen it for some time, when the boat rounded a point, and he could see that Grot and Kipping were already on board, and they were heading for him. Survivors had been weakened by their ordeal, but they were still alive, and the captain of the Amicilia and his crew took care of the castaways until they landed at Batavia on August 28th. Here, too, they met with kindness and were well received once their story was known. There was added drama when the captain of the ship Olivier Van Noord arrived on the 30th of August and announced that he had seen a large fire on Christmas Island on the evening of the 24th. Since it was the day after the Amicilia had removed the 3 castaways from the island, and the survivors had never been able to make a fire, it created a hope that Kenneth, Grot, and Kipping were not the only survivors of the Vice Admiral Rijk that had made it to the island. The steamer Samarang was sent to Christmas Island to make a thorough search of the island, but returned empty-handed. The mystery of the fire on Christmas Island was never resolved. The residents of Batavia started a collection that got to be a respectable size and was then dispersed, with a portion going to the families of those who had not survived the wreck of the Vice Admiral Rijk, and the rest being distributed between the 3 survivors. The General Assembly in Batavia also gave a medal and a certificate to the captain of the Amicilia for his role in saving the men from Christmas Island. Kenneth, Grot, and Kipping were the first documented residents of Christmas Island, and this was an inauspicious start that did not encourage anyone else to think of living there. Christmas Island was only settled in the 1880s, when phosphate reserves were found on the island, and Britain claimed it as part of their empire. With something on the island that was desirable, a settlement soon followed. The Vice Admiral Rijk was not a large ship, or one carrying large amounts of treasure, and so little effort was put into finding it once it had sunk until recently. Now it is thought that the Vice Admiral Rijk might point to a fortune, though, or more specifically, a ship named Fortuin. In 1724, the Dutch ship the Fortuin was on her maiden voyage when she disappeared. The last sighting of her was in the vicinity of Christmas Island. What happened to her has long been a mystery, but it is thought that what happened to the Vice Admiral Rijk over 100 years later might hold the answer. The Vice Admiral Rijk struck and almost immediately sank too quickly for an organized evacuation. The lack of any signs of survivors of the Fortuin suggests that she probably sank quickly. When the 3 survivors of the Vice Admiral Rijk came ashore, they could see the wreck, suggesting that the ship initially rested on the very narrow coastal shelf of Christmas Island. Since it is fairly well known where the Vice Admiral Rijk came to rest due to the description of the survivors, the members of the wreck check searched for the remains of the ship, but in vain. They came to the conclusion that it seems likely that the Vice Admiral Rijk most likely remained mostly intact and slid off of the coastal shelf into water deeper than the 30 meters that were the limits of wreck check's equipment. Since the Fortuin was a brand new vessel, and a strongly built one, it seems likely that she might have had the same fate. There is hope that if the Vice Admiral Rijk can be found, she might give hints as to what happened to the Fortuin. That, and the many other ships that have met their fate around the coasts of Christmas Island.
For more information, please see page 3 of the Singapore Free Press and Mercantile Advertiser from October 8, 1852, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.